This is the Aptitude Outdoors Podcast, where we interview conservationists, hunters, anglers, and outdoorsmen and women to bring you the greatest stories, information, and advice from the best in the world. All right, everybody, welcome back to the Aptitude Outdoors Podcast. Today, our special guest is Gabriella Hoffman. She's a media strategist, consultant, award-winning outdoors writer, host of the District of Conservation podcast, and she is really knowledgeable on a lot of conservation issues. So I hope you really enjoy this episode. We talk a lot about policy in conservation. We talk a lot about how, Canada's restricting gun rights hopefully does not affect our gun rights as hunters here in the United States. We kind of go down that rabbit hole and a lot more. So I hope you enjoy this episode. But first, a quick word from our sponsors. I don't know about you, but I always carry a knife. It doesn't matter what the situation is, I'm always reaching for a blade. Whether I'm out hunting in the backwoods, fishing on lakes and rivers, or simply cutting rope at camp. And when I need a tool, I want something that's quality, durable, and handmade right here in the USA. I know that's something you're looking for as well, so go to maloneknives.com and get yourself something that's going to last and look damn good too. I'm a huge fanatic for handmade, high-quality leather and canvas products. In my opinion, they last longer, hold up better to the abuses of travel, and honestly, they just look really cool. That's why I use Badger Claw Outfitters. They've been making handcrafted products for hunting, camping, and travel since 2011, and that's right up my alley. Best part is they're made right here in the USA and are guaranteed for life. They've got everything from gun leather, belts, custom knife sheaths, wallets, duffel bags, leather and canvas pouches, everyday carry items, and more. Badger Claw Outfitters, made in the USA, built for the wild. All right, well, thank you for coming on the podcast. As a fellow busy person, I understand how stressful it can be to talk all the time. So I got some questions for you about conservation. I love that you're kind of pushing this conservation message to the world, because it's something that is not talked about in an insane amount in like the public eye, but also when it is talked about, it's usually negative stuff. So where, to step back to the beginning, where did you get involved in conservation? Because it's not like a normal path for especially younger people. You've been living in this conservation and writing world for a while, but how did that start for you?
I think it goes to having a personal connection. So if you want to be, I would say, a thought leader, newsmaker, or commentator on conservation, you should have some proximity to the issue. I was very fortunate, having grown up in California, to have experienced the outdoors. I got an early taste of it when I would go with my family to various different national parks, the first being Yosemite and Sequoia and Kings Canyon, really early. So I got to see what camping was like, these kind of cool natural structures. And I started fishing from an early age, a lot of coastal fishing and then a lot of freshwater fishing as well. So I was kind of baptized by fire into those activities. My dad taught me how to fish. So naturally, of course, you get into that through a parent. And then California, even though it has its conservation problems, it has a lot of mismanagement. They're not following conservation. At the core of the state, it's one of the most outdoorsy states. Like you could go, the cliche is, or rather the refrain is, that you can experience all four seasons in a day. And I didn't get to exactly do that, but I did go to at least two different, environments in a day. You could easily do that from the beach, the mountains, that kind of thing. So it was very feasible to be able to do that. And for me, it just was natural to, I guess, translate it to policy. And for me, I didn't think I could engage in this in college so much. Like I was really turned off by the environmentalism at my university. I went to the University of California, San Diego, and they were really big into like, capitalism is so bad for the environment. People are always having a negative footprint. And it just turned me off. And I was like, I will never engage in these issues. And then fast forward a few years later, I was like, actually, I can engage on these issues and not feel guilty about myself or have to adopt views that I don't agree with and still be able to push a stewardship, balanced use message. And I would say the full turning point for me when I entered it, I guess, in a writing capacity, I was writing about it a little bit in political columns. I think in 2013, 2014, I would talk a little bit about hunting. I then freelanced in an official capacity for Wide Open Spaces, I would say 2015, 2016. And then I understood, kind of a light bulb went off in my head. I was like, wow, I can even talk about this in public policy. And it just grew into other writing opportunities. I was covering the natural resources environment beat for an upstart publication for like 4 years. Then I returned to the political outlet that I write for as a freelance columnist, townhall.com. And I focus on these issues as often as I can, almost every Friday whenever I publish my column. It's largely environmental or conservation based topics there. And then when I launched my podcast in 2018, after recognizing a deficit in lack of discussion about public policy issues and wanting to deconstruct kind of certain narratives and certain policies, because I saw that people were conflating conservation with preservation, which we can go into if you want to dabble into definitions and differences.
Yes, because
but I would see that. Yeah, absolutely. So I would see that newsmakers and people with big platforms were conflating terrible mismanagement of, let's say, forests or not respecting of private property rights in the balance of multiple use, and treating people, hunters and anglers, as terrible stakeholders for conservation. And that didn't sit well with me. So I was like, I can uncover this. I can bring on thought leaders and newsmakers to talk about what is trending in their states, what's happening federally. I can go off on different monologues and assess good and bad legislation federally, statewide level, government directives, fiats coming from agencies, things of that sort. So I kind of took it upon myself, and I'm not the only one who does this. I just maybe do it in like a sole capacity in a podcast, like all the time. Yeah. There are people who do dedicate their podcast to legislation. I have friends who run the Your Mountain podcast, 2 great guys from Wyoming that I know who've mentored me with hunting. In my hunting journey, I was able to get my first deer doing a trip with them and some of their friends a couple years ago. And so they do a great job on policy because they've worked on these issues in Wyoming. For the governor, a former governor of Wyoming, they work in their respective policy realms now in the gun industry and somewhat in conservation. But aside from me, them, and a handful of others, like there's not really much of a podcast or, let's say, a commentator, maybe apart from certain nonprofits like the Sportsman's Alliance and a new group called Howl for Wildlife, who really dedicate to exposing good, bad, ugly legislation. But in a media format, occasionally Meat Eater will talk about it, and some others do too. But I'd like to think me and a handful of others who do talk more about policy, have more of a proximity to it, try to dedicate as much time to it. And there's no shortage of things to discuss. I mean, 2023, even though it's not really a politically charged year, it's an off year. There's a lot of stuff coming down the pipeline federally and also a bit in the state legislatures. You have to kind of look to see, what your governor is doing now. Who are they appointing to state wildlife agency boards? You have to see what your state house and state senate are supporting or not supporting, and just really keep a watchful eye. So I have a lot to work with, even though it's an off year politically. And you often see more in, even number years whenever there's a presidential or midterm election and responding to that. But conservation is kind of a hot topic right now. There's no shortage of content. And yeah, I like to be kind of the eyes and ears to it. And I hope with what I'm doing, my genuflecting and whatever I'm trying to draw awareness to, I hope others take an interest and run with what I give them or run with what I'm saying, explore it themselves. They don't have to agree. They can disagree and kind of assess for themselves, and just to be watchful of what happens, because certain decisions can really displace us from the conversation. We see a lot of things happen behind the scenes. I'm often privy about exposing that. I even go beyond conservation and try to draw connections to other industries and showcase that a lot of industries that are portrayed very poorly are actually natural partners with conservationists, and you don't have to, bite the hand that feeds you to be a conservationist. And you can be respectful of different things and how to navigate all this. So that's kind of, I guess, my thinking and my journey into it and what I hope to accomplish. And I have a few public policy roles. I work with the Independent Women's Forum, where I'm trying to educate women, especially about conservation and kind of the balance between industry and multiple use and how all that kind of configures with one another. So it's a unique position to be in. I don't want to be the only person, but if I can inspire people to care about these issues, maybe it'll trigger some sort of like multiplier effect. I hope that's what my work does, but I appreciate you, kind of acknowledging that and complimenting me. It's a really high compliment that people pay attention. I sometimes think like the efforts that I do don't go noticed. And it's not about trying to get attention. I don't want to become famous. I just want people to be aware and be able to have tools at their disposal and to care. Because if you lose something here in the States, you'll never be able to get it back. We have a really unique conservation model here, and to lose that and to lose balance use and to lose stewardship that has worked so well for this country would be really concerning for me. To have extremists, whether they're radical environmentalists or people who just want to develop everything, take the mantle. So I think there's a balance that needs to be achieved, and that's what I hope to accomplish.
Yeah, and that's a great introduction to what you do, and I think it's really important to have like watchdogs out there watching what's going on, because for the average Joe, the average hunter, the average outdoorsman, outdoorswoman, it is very confusing, especially when it gets into the political level for a lot of things, myself included. That's why I often defer to people like you and experts in the industry who have a lot deeper understanding of the political side of things. And quickly, can you kind of differentiate for people between the difference between preservation and conservation? Because I talked to Gray Thornton of the Wild Sheep Foundation, and he really hammered on that on a podcast we did too. And there's like a very different mindset approach to preservation versus conservation. I don't think a lot of people understand that.
Yes, and the definition needs to be made distinct, of course. And are there instances of good preservation? I think there can be, like the national parks, for instance. I think the 63 that we have are well deserving of those protections. I think that's where preservation comes into play, and, certain state parks and other places where you largely go to explore. There's definitely a purpose need for that. But when you have preservation as a wholesale model, that's where it becomes really dangerous, because it is presented as under the guise of conservation. It's going to be great for you. We're going to engage you. But what I've seen the federal government do under, let's say, the guise of a 30 by 30 proposal, it says that they're going to protect public lands. But sometimes what happens with creating certain designations, you unintentionally, maybe intentionally displace people from conversations. We see that, unfortunately, with national monument designations sometime. But preservation, in my interpretation of it, and I think what people are understanding it to be, it kind of dissuades people. It treats human involvement in the environment as a negative thing. It's never viewed as a positive thing. And they say, well, no, it's to protect, from excesses of this. But when you really dig deep into the meaning of it, it really does not welcome people. And those who want to be at the helms of preservationist policies really want to keep regular people off of public lands. They say that everyone is welcome. Public lands are open for all, but they support restrictions to hunting and fishing. And hunting and fishing, as you very well know and your listeners know, is one of the biggest contributors, funding-wise, effort-wise, et cetera, to conservation. You won't have conservation without hunters and anglers. So when I see policies that pretend to be for public lands, but you're displacing people who are big actors in this space, that is not conservation, that's preservation. Conservation, to me, it should be viewed like this. It's like a wise management of natural resources and stewardship. I like the term stewardship better than I do preservation. I think that encompasses, like, there are some areas we can leave for preservation, but we want everything to be kind of conservation minded. You can allow for multiple use management. You can allow for public lands access. You can allow for private property rights, and you can allow for public-private partnerships and stakeholders working together. And then you also have to factor in my view, I unfortunately see a lot of the federal government, and it's not because I'm an anarchist or anything like that, but for me, when states and private stakeholders and public interests at the state level, local level, when they have an idea, let's say they want to reform a policy, they want to allow for wildlife corridors or something of that nature, or they want to manage a delisted recovered species like a grizzly bear or a gray wolf, I see in those kinds of instances where there are established partnerships, true conservation at play, where different problems can be remedied, even forest management, what have you. The federal government, what I've seen recently, can come in and say, well, we don't want to have these reforms. We don't want to have permitting reform. We don't want to have forest management reform. And they continually just want to blame, find a problem, and they'll never be able to allow you to, even though you have the infrastructure at the state and local level, to enact a solution to an environmental problem. They're going to hold you back with red tape and other roadblocks, because for them it's advantageous to say, we have a problem, let's put more money to the problem, without offering a solution, a tangible solution to the problem. So for me, I can see the government, which should be working in our interests, sometimes being a hindrance, actually, oftentimes being a hindrance to environmental progress, to true conservation, and complicate the the framework so much that you really dissuade people from wanting to be engaged. When you start to tell people that you need to pay more for your energy consumption to be able to be a conservationist, people don't see the math with that. Or they tell them you need to stop hunting, or you need to stop eating fish, or you need to stop doing this to really be a conservationist. And when you put those limitations on people and tell them they're evil for engaging in practices, even though they're adhering to environmental stewardship, you really dissuade people from wanting to care about the environment. That's why we see people tune out from environmentalism or conservation oftentimes when they're starting to pay more for energy costs or for living expenses. And that's a problem we in conservation have perennially faced. And that's where I think if you don't hold government accountable, they can cause a lot of ruin in the environment. We've seen in 2015, there was a Gold King mine spill. And this was supposed to be an environmentally friendly administration. Then the Obama administration, their EPA, they had hired contractors and they were responsible for the spill. And there wasn't really much blowback from environmentalists so much. They were angry, but it was kind of ironic that that was able to transpire despite claiming we're upholding the most environmentally friendly standards. And they took forever to clean that up. So there's always been mishaps. Private actors can ruin the environment, government can ruin the environment. But oftentimes what I see now is government is preventing people from reaching real solutions. And you don't need a top-down government approach necessarily to be a conservationist and to implement conservationist policies. Out west, we're starting to see people lean on landowners and private public partnerships that don't necessarily require the federal government to come there. So the difference between preservation and conservation, long story short, is really easy to make out. And like I said, some limited instances of preservation are good. National Park Service, sensitive areas definitely require something like that. But if everything is preservationist, nothing is conservationist. And we have to treat people who want to impact the landscape positively as conservationists. Humans can have a good impact, I think, despite all the negative attention heralded as us as a species. But we've done a lot in the United States compared to the rest of the world to have clean air, clean water, wildlife management that is to a T. We've had an abundance and resurgence of imperiled species come back from extinction. No other country can really top what we've done here. So I want people to take away that conservation is a positive philosophy, that your input is positive, that you can have an impact without necessarily leaning on the government per se. And then you can change the trajectory of a environmental solution. You can use private enterprise to help push technology to fix a problem as well. So we have to think of our involvement as a net positive rather than everything being so doom and gloom and negative. And we got to exclude people from this. And only few people can have concentrated power over conservation decisions. And when that happens, people become in the dark. We see a lot with, recreational fishing, losing potential access to certain ocean spots because of perceived threats to whales. We see that with lobstering. We see different challenges onshore too, where hunters may lose access to certain things. They've banned lead, tackle, and ammunition for new openings of national wildlife refuges. That could be seen as a price out of people from activities, from public land access, if you can argue that. So, people do see the differences now. It's a lot more tangible, and we definitely have to hone in on that. So that's kind of a long-winded explanation of it and some parallels to it, but I wanted your listeners to grasp that.
Hey, what's up, everyone? James Appleton here, co-founder of Absolute Aid. Welcome to the Seek to Do More program. This program will help you help yourself by developing the daily habits that will elevate your entire life. Over the next 30 days, you'll complete the doers list every single day. And the doers list includes 1, do something physical. 2, follow and stick to your diet of choice. 3, read a real book. 4, further your education on purpose. 5, dedicate time to your spiritual life. And 6, dedicate time to your hobbies. So if you're ready to take a structured, proven approach to build the daily habits that will allow you to get the most out of yourself, your time, and your life every single day, the Seek to Do More program is your blueprint. So make a choice, commit to yourself, sign up below, and let's get started.
Yeah, and it's really important to understand that difference. And, a lot of the times with hunting specifically, I mean, fishing gets lumped into that. It's just all kind of rolled up into the same ball. But it's like you're essentially telling people when you're going into like preservation and stuff like that, that you're not okay with them doing something that humans have been doing for like hundreds of thousands of years. And all of a sudden, like, oh, we're bad people for hunting and fishing, when most of the hunters that I know and I associate with are very much like not just a general conservationist in the fact that they buy their license, they buy their firearms and ammos and stuff. Like even at a minimum level, they're contributing, but a lot of them push for conservation. They're involved in conservation organizations that are trying to tip things politically and making sure that things are not getting like completely run over laws, limiting restrictions, limiting people's access. So I think that's really important for people to understand that difference. And I'm glad you summed it up that way, because that was a very, very good way of talking about it. I want to step back to talking about college, because I went to college for environmental anthropology, and it was the same thing. I came to the same conclusion as you, as like, we're constantly told that everything we're doing as human beings in this, like in these places are terrible. It's our fault as individuals for eating meat or going to the grocery store or buying a candy bar every now and then or something in plastic. And that, as I got older and, you know, the more I studied conservation as a whole, I realized that I did not agree with that at all. And that's what led me to hunting, actually, is I view it as a very much more sustainable model than, you know, like mega farming and things which are necessary to some extent, because not everybody's going to hunt. So, you know, what are your thoughts on that? Because like institutionally, I think colleges are just becoming these like weird places where you're just told what you have to think all the time. And I'm not a huge fan of that.
Yeah, the college has largely deviated, the university system rather, from any expression of free thought. But I am encouraged by land grant universities, and where you still have these colleges of natural resources, where you have welcome discussion about hunting. There is, I had a friend recently kind of shadow a group of Virginia Tech wildlife biology majors, and none of them, despite studying this field, getting acquainted with it, hoping to have a career in it post-graduation, none of them have ever shot a gun, according to his post, prior to their hunt, and none of them had gone hunting. And so I'm encouraged, even with what is percolating in universities and probably this notion of, you know, eating meat is terrible, your environmental footprint is bad, your very existence is horrible for the environment. You see alternatively at some universities, largely in the South, somewhat in the Midwest, and anywhere where there's like a land grant school or a college of natural resources, you do see kind of the opposite of that happening. You see university students being challenged to learn about hunting. I think there was even a study from, I think it was North Carolina State University, that went into, they even conducted a study like that was really fair to hunting as conservation and how much money is appropriated, what goes into it. And so depending upon the university, although they're more scarce, I think there's still a conversation, and there's also different groups that encourage hunting. There's chapters of the different various national groups. You'll see like a Delta Waterfowl chapter, Ducks Unlimited University chapter, National Wildlife Turkey Federation chapter. So some of the groups do have a footprint in these universities where the kids are being exposed to hunting. They're learning about where their food comes from. They're seeing how much more sustainable it is and what those monies do, and how they're dispersed to the different states and for the different functions and programs that those monies go to. So I am a little encouraged with that. But yes, we do have, I think in terms of changing the narrative on hunting, we started to make gains, even among younger people, new participants. And I myself am an adult onset hunter as well. I started with fishing, then shooting sports, then came to hunting a little later in life because it was just more feasible for me to do it once I became self-employed. But I think the narrative can change, and I would hope young people are more open-minded. I am a little miffed with where Generation Z is, because certain things they're open-minded to things, but hunting, I'm not sure if they're really buying into the animal rights advocate kind of philosophy, or are they open to hunting? I think we need to see more scholarship on how do we engage the younger kids, but most of them are starting to become social media savvy. I start to see influencers now hunting and fishing more and try to engage in the industry. They're not full-fledged in the industry just quite yet, but I think there could be opportunities even with this kind of omnipresent tech social media activity we're noticing, good or bad. There are good things and bad things to it, but I think social media as a vehicle could introduce more college-age kids to hunting and fishing, but there still needs to be education. It's not necessarily our fault, but it's a lot of the people, anti-hunting interests and even sometimes anti-fishing interests, do have a monopoly over in stewardship discussion, conservation discussion. But like I said, in these schools where there's some normalcy left, where they still learn about where their food comes from, how the conservation model works, what goes into all of this, and they get to experience to go into the field. I think those students will be far more equipped than their counterparts at different schools or at universities without a land grant kind of foundation or a natural resources college to learn about it. And they may be exposed later on in life when it's determined that it's really cool. It's really funny. I don't know if you noticed this too, but a lot of the younger kids on social media, everyone was starting to wear like a Bass Pro hat as a trend, like ironically.
I did see
and
that.
I'm like, Bass Pro should have capitalized on that becoming a thing. I don't think they had anything to do with it, but they could have been like, hey, we see you wearing our hat. Learn about conservation. That could have been a marketing campaign ploy that they could have tackled there a bit more. But it was funny that people were kind of like appropriating a Bass Pro hat, but they weren't really fishing. It was just a fashion statement. So it is creeping in slowly but surely through kind of cultural phenomenons like that, but they could have seized on that a little more.
Yeah, and I did notice that. That's funny you say that. And I think, well, the problem is when you get up to that level of that size of a corporation, they kind of tend to get out of touch with like how social media and stuff works. And they're like, these dang kids and their social medias and their TikToks. And it's like, well, dude, you could have made $1 billion just then selling like hunting and fishing and tackle and stuff for kids that are coming to your store to buy hats. But anyway, I know you have a hard deadline. One thing that I really wanted to touch on that was kind of very touchy issue for a lot of people, and especially now with how Canada is handling their firearms and stuff. I know you talk about this a lot. I actually had a conversation with a guy on Instagram recently. He's in Canada, and he's like, it's really impacting me as a hunter of like what I'm allowed to do now owning firearms. So what are your thoughts on this whole Canada restricting all of their gun laws and making it damn near impossible for people to like get their hands on even like the most simple hunting weapons at this point in time?
The Canada case study is something for us to really pay attention to and follow, because I know some people in hunting, maybe some people in the West will posit and say that, you know, there will never be this gun grab. And I know that's a cliche thing to say. Like they say, we will never see disarmament of people. Why do you need an AR-15? Why do you need a more modern sporting rifle? Why do you need this? And I know that's a debate that is often waged in the hunting sphere and the greater outdoors industry too. But you look at the Canada model and you see people here who don't support the Second Amendment say, let's replicate what Canada has. I like to think, you know, you have to follow the trends. You got to see what the rest of the world is doing, or especially our neighbor to the north. If they're doing this, whether it's a messaging thing or they fully go through with it, there's not even an exception. Not that there has to be exceptions to prohibitions. Prohibitions are terrible outright, of course, but they're not even giving an exception to the Canadian natives who rely on firearms for subsistence, for hunting, that way of life as well. So they're pricing, and rather they're restricting everyone, even some of the special interests or the interests that they deal with and support supposedly in Canada. And when you see that they're banning handguns and semi-automatic rifles and most, you know, accepted firearms here in this country that would never be considered something to ban, that should, you know, raise some alarms in your mind and be like, if that can happen in Canada, that can happen here if we're not very careful, because we do have very determined activists who conflate assault weapons with AR-15s. And if you know the mechanics of a firearm, that's mechanically not the case. Most AR-15s, I just built one myself, a partial build, and I've shot AR-15s dozens of times. And most of the guns, maybe except for one, was a semi-automatic retrofit. Like there was one where it could be interchangeable, but it was just used for recreational safe shooting. I wasn't wanting to get it for myself, but aside from that one instance where you can have the mechanics change a bit, most of the ARs you're shooting with are semi-automatic, much like a handgun. One pull of the trigger, one bullet, not a flurry of bullets, you know, spraying out in that case. But it's just, there's a lack of understanding with some of my peers in media. I think it's gotten a little better because I have a colleague, a good friend of mine who, I don't know if you know The Reload, run by Stephen Gutowski. He's a firearms journalist, and he's kind of forced other journalists to have to accurately report on the mechanics, the ballistics, the nomenclature associated with different firearms. And he's forced that conversation. There's still people, including the president, who love to misinterpret what those various parts are, and they conflate, you know, different mechanics and different utilities, and really just try to jumble what these different meanings are in. And when you're dealing with a highly mechanized thing like a firearm, it's really important to pay attention to detail and to know the differences and to know, shotgun is very different from a modern sporting rifle. A handgun is very different from a fully automatic, rifle or AK-47, what have you. And while the Second Amendment is not anywhere remotely about guaranteeing your right to hunt, there is a connection, as you very well know, because of Pittman-Robertson. All the money's largely divvied from guns and ammunition purchases go back to funding conservation. And I think that model is widely accepted by everyone. Second Amendment supporters like it too, even though I have been very miffed about fellow conservatives who have supported the Return Act, which is a horrible bill. I would not recommend it whatsoever to people. That would not promote the Second Amendment, and we'd lose at least $700-800 million for conservation. Through that and you would lose the ability to fund public target shooting ranges, which are also funded by Pittman-Robertson funds. So you will lose your Second Amendment to go to public ranges on public lands. Very silly bill. It's a messaging bill, but it's not going to gain any traction from what I see. But there is that connection. And in Canada, I know it's very different, where they view hunting as an essential right. They don't have a Second Amendment. That's Canada's mistake. They never enshrined a Second Amendment. And maybe if new leadership comes in, they can amend their constitution to prevent this from happening in the future. I'm not sure how they orient themselves, but that's what their parliament would have to do. If enough people were like, we want to be like the United States, our friends to the south understand this. And we've already dabbled with this. We can't experience this again, this loss of rights and this loss of, to have a hunting rifle as a way of sustenance, because I think the United States, and save for a few other countries in Europe, we view guns and gun ownership as a fundamental right with the Second Amendment. And a couple countries in Europe that had communism and National Socialism, Nazism, they view that too, including my ancestral homeland of Lithuania, which they view protection, self-defense as probably the greatest motivator behind gun purchases. Then hunting comes in. But most of Europe is hunting is a sacred right that is guaranteed through you for having a firearm. But Canada, I think, views it very similarly, like much of Europe does. And when you have that gives Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister, and the Parliament the ability to say, well, we're going to ration and we're going to prohibit this because we don't like it, because there's no right constituted for Canadians to be able to keep and bear arms. And even having so-called exceptions, they're never guaranteed to. Like I said, the native population of Canada, I don't know if they're going to get an exemption from this, but I think it's going to affect so many people, even some Labour Party supporters in Canada, whatever Justin Trudeau's party is. It's going to turn off so many people. I think there could be backlash to that. But would we see a translation of that here in the United States? Not necessarily, except for maybe states like California, New York, where they've attempted this. But we have a judicial system which checks excesses in the legislative process or the lawmaking process. So Illinois may try to ban all guns, including even modern sporting rifles that could be used for hunting. But you see law enforcement speaking out against it. You see the court saying you're actually violating the Second Amendment here and this is not good, things of that sort. So you see attempts to try to strip people of gun ownership here, but we have checks and balances, unlike Canada. But if you give people the idea that, hey, we're implementing this, we're doing this, you may give bad actors an idea who have and are able to wield power. And the gun control lobby, we can call them that, they do wield a lot of influence now, far more than some gun manufacturers or far more than some gun rights lobby and interests, things of that sort. So they're a lot more powerful. They have a lot more money behind them now. But their arguments don't stand the test of court or the test of public opinion, because people see what happens when you are implementing gun control. You're basically punishing law-abiding people and not attacking wrongdoers whatsoever. And how does hunting figure into that kind of equation? It does absolutely, because you could even see, I've even seen kind of with the Return Act and some other things that the people who often support gun control don't often like hunting either. And they would love to see the disentanglement of Pittman-Robertson funds from guns and ammunition excise taxes. They want to see that because they view hunters and anglers in a very negative light. They think, like I said, back to the conservation versus preservation model, they think we're despoilers of the landscape, that we don't care about wildlife. We just want to kill everything that comes into our sight or catch every fish imaginable. So they can apply the same animus towards the Second Amendment as they do to hunting, but we still have to obviously acknowledge the differences because the Second Amendment doesn't guarantee hunting. But I don't know if your listeners or you know this, you probably do, and I'm probably repeating, is preaching to the choir, but individual states actually have right to hunt and fish amendments. So when, let's say, animal rights advocates try to restrict your ability, and actually 45 of 50 states have Second Amendment protections in their state constitutions too, as well. But you have a protection for hunting under your state constitution. There's no federal right to hunt and fish amendment. Maybe that would be something lawmakers could toy with in the future, but most states, I would say, have that protection, with the exception, I think, of California, Rhode Island, and a handful of others. And so you have to be really, really careful, because if you treat, like, a lot of people who dismiss the Second Amendment say, well, and the president too, he has said the Second Amendment is about duck hunting. You don't need an AR-15 to go duck hunting. So they conflate the Second Amendment with hunting, which is erroneous to do that. Mm-hmm. Even though there is a financial mechanism that does connect the two activities, and you can, obviously it's important to make that aware and apparent, and we want to have impacts on conservation, wildlife habitat restoration, wildlife conservation efforts, hunters education, target shooting ranges. We should, because we're the ones who are primarily funding these activities. So it's okay to have that connection through the Pittman-Robertson Act. But yeah, if Second Amendment is not enough, they're going to go after hunting. That's a bare minimum. We see this with their attacks on bear hunting, bear management, coyote predator contests. I know some people find that very controversial, but you see a lot more coyote pet conflicts. Coyotes are attacking people. They are known to have rabies. And if you don't manage them, your little chihuahua or whatever could be killed in that instance. So that's always something that people are like, oh, I don't really like this, but they like to do incremental bans, and incremental bans could give rise to total bans. So Canada is the most extreme case. And so that worries me. So while knowing the different caveats, the differences between the Second Amendment and right to hunt and fish, and how they're interconnected through the Pittman-Robertson Act, I think it's important to care about all activities. There was a National Wildlife Federation study about 10 years ago that said people who care about the Second Amendment equally care about conservation. And that's very uniformly true. So you talk to anyone, SHOT Show is this week, NSSF, they're very big into conservation, even though they're the trade association of the gun manufacturers and ammunition manufacturers. It's all interrelated. You will find very little deviation on that. People very much who support responsible gun use do care about stewardship of lands and stewardship of wildlife. And so it's important to keep in mind that and to keep that going in the United States, and not look to Canada and not become Canada, because that would be very, very dangerous. And when you lose freedoms, you're not able to get them back.
Yeah. 100% agree. Well, I know you have a hard deadline. I appreciate your time. We covered a lot in a very short amount of time. So thank you. Before you take off, could you just let people know, my listeners, if they're not familiar with your work and your podcast, so they could learn more about you?
Absolutely, Paul. So I have many places I could link your listeners to. I'm on social media, very easy to find me, Gabby Hoffman or Gabriella Hoffman, denoted by blue checks. But you can go to my website, GabriellaHoffman.com. I have all my affiliations there. I also run the District of Conservation podcast. Would love your listeners to check in and see what is happening. I also do a lot of write-ups at townhall.com, Independent Women's Forum, and a whole wide swath of different places. I also have a Substack account called Outsider on the Inside, and I'm going to try to dedicate my newsletter more to like these natural resources hunting updates. It's just a matter of, can I put my pen to paper more often? Because as you know, it's very difficult to try to formulate stuff, and you want to write something and you want to be thoughtful and you want to be able to have the space. So I have a lot of different links. Would love to link up with your listeners. Happy to answer any questions, give resources on how to follow legislation, how to follow what's trending, and be a guide. So thank you so much for having me. It was lovely to talk to you and to exchange ideas.